Well, welcome everybody to another round of Lecture Live. So the last time we met, we discussed Peter Paul Rubens, who was kind of he was from Flanders, so kind of this area of the southern Netherlands, and kind of called the Lowlands. They call it the Lowlands too. And he was kind of the child of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So the quintessential Catholic Counter-Reformation painter in the North. Rembrandt van Rijn is the exact opposite of Peter Paul Rubens. But both of them have been tied in to be like two of the major or greatest artists of this Northern Baroque period, or really of the 16th going into the 17th century. So Rembrandt, though, was from the Northern Netherlands, which is what they would be called today, but it was once referred to as the Dutch Republic. So it was founded in 1588, and it was very much a Protestant split from the Catholic Church. So it was no longer under the authority of the Pope. It was no longer under any sort of monarchy per se, but it was a true republic. So in that sense, Rembrandt differs a lot from Peter Paul Rubens because his subject matter centers more along the lines in this very much this Protestant culture. Oh, oops, there we go. So, now, the Dutch Republic it really was the birthplace of all of these genres, like the popularity of these genres. It's kind of where landscape got started as an actual genre, where still life got started as an actual genre. And that was because the church was not necessarily Protestant churches were not commissioning paintings as they were kind of in Italy or Southern, or, kind of what we consider Southern Europe, particularly not in the Southern Netherlands either. So they weren't commissioning these large altarpieces. They weren't going within churches. And in the Republic, these trade routes were being founded. We've got the Dutch East India Trading Company, which I'm sure everybody has heard of. Because not only was this like an independent state, it was establishing trade routes, thus the patronage and people that were interested in art started to change as well. We actually have a shift from individual patrons that are making these larger commissions. They really are kind of the more wealthy, of higher social status, that can afford these kind of things, to a larger true art market that involved kind of this upper middle class that was really starting to benefit from this kind of onset of capitalism that was happening. It's kind of like the birthplace of capitalism, really. So you will see a lot of scenes. So this is by Rembrandt as well. Rembrandt really gets into landscapes sort of kind of in the middle of his career, but I wanted to show you, since we're talking about the Dutch Republic too, that there was a lot of pride in this very new state, right? In this new country. And because of that, they took a great amount of pride in their landscape. And the landscape could depict different things. It could depict like this idyllic escape from the city. It could depict kind of the hard work and the labor often seen. Sometimes you'll see bleaching fields. Sometimes you'll see manual labor work, such as farms, various things that would have taken place out in the country that would have helped their market. You'll see windmills as well. Like this is where we get like the windmill scenery that it originated in the Dutch Republic. So they took really great pride in kind of this newfound land, right? It was their own now. And so this is kind of how they declared their new cultural identity and their newfound kind of independence from the Catholic Church, from the Pope, and from monarchies. So Rembrandt took place in this as well. And we haven't studied earlier Northern works because this is mainly centered on Northern Baroque art. But earlier Netherlandish prints were included, kind of like Albert Dürer, who was kind of a top dog in the print world, and other very fine printmakers, but Rembrandt really kind of differentiated himself because he was interested in kind of different things. He was interested in experimentation, and prints for Rembrandt was where he could conduct experiments, test them on this new art market, see if they were popular, and then he can make paintings, right? And so there was kind of a system to this whole thing. And this was much different from any sort of workshops or guilds that were happening in very more Catholic Europe that we're still getting commissions, large scale commissions, working within guilds and workshops in the South. But with this new art market, with this newfound version of capitalism that we have, all of that started to change. And this is where Rembrandt could really start to experiment. So he would make sketchings like this and see if they did well in the art market. And then he would produce paintings like this that would also sell for more money. So now that we kind of did a brief rundown, the Dutch Republic is very young. They're taking a lot of pride in their work, and artists are starting to reflect that cultural pride as they're becoming more interested in kind of daily life, daily aspects found in Dutch life, right? And that's kind of where still life comes from. So everything is tied into, in a way, this new cultural identity. Rembrandt, though, even though this new cultural identity is being kind of carved out, tends to do his own thing, which is why we love him. So he was, although his heart, and we'll look at some of his more historical paintings in a little bit, but although his heart was in history paintings, so largely biblical or mythological scenes, he was really renowned as being a portraitist. It's kind of like Rubens was interested in history scenes, but he was really renowned for painting women, right? Rembrandt was known for this sense of really capturing the inner essence of his sitters. And he practiced this on himself. These are 3 portraits by him, and he's got many, many more. He's got an entire printed series where he's just where he's practicing different facial expressions, showing different expression or expressive faces, different emotions and how they play on, certain lines of the eyes when somebody smiles or when somebody frowns or when somebody's angry. So he's definitely experimental, and we can see this now. We're seeing even in his earlier work, which is this self-portrait on the left, he's got very loose brushstrokes, and it's almost coarse, right? Like, look at this hair. It's almost as he took kind of the butt of the brush, of the paintbrush, and kind of just like carved in that hair. And we can actually see kind of these rougher brushstrokes. But his face, the main part of his face is really enveloped in shadow. So he's starting to really experiment, even at this young in his career, with an inner life, an inner expression. Is he kind of solemn? Is he a bit sad? He's starting to experiment with these things. And these portraits are obviously from his later career, where he is now identifying himself. There are no real identification markers here about who he is or what he does. In this central picture, we can definitely see him as an artist, right? Even though he's not pictured with any accoutrements like the artist's stick or anything like that. He's definitely got this he's got this black on, kind of a symbol. Although black was very popular, it is also a symbol of kind of this upper middle class. And in this portrait on the right, we can actually see that he's garbed in this very elaborate costume. So towards the end of his career, he thought that he had made it, right? He's in the upper echelon of society, and that's how he depicted himself, which is similar to how Rubens depicted himself as well. Now, in this spirit of inner reflection, this is Rembrandt, artist in his studio. This is meant to be Rembrandt right here, and he is staring at a very large canvas. Now, remember when I said that his heart was in history paintings? History paintings were typically very, very large. And so we can presume that this canvas is a history painting, although the painting is actually hidden from us. And it's very contemplative, right? He's not working from life right here. He is working, this is all coming from his head, because he can't just go and study himself. And now theoretically he could, and artists did, they would use mirrors if they were depicting themselves in self-portraits. That's actually most likely what he did. with these as well. But this one is unique as he is no longer kind of using that mirror. This is all coming from his mind. And not only is Rembrandt himself contemplating this piece of art, contemplating this painting, we actually see his represented self, his painter self right here, complimenting this painting. So it's very meta. And scholars, historians have a field day with it. They love it. But this inner being, this inner essence was very, very popular, and that's what Rembrandt was known for. Now, when we get into his portraits, Rembrandt is very popular in the sense of like, there are some portraits that we have that are not well documented, right? Like that we're not sure who the sitters are, but Rembrandt was very prolific in painting not only portraits, but also what we categorize as tronies. And that just means that it's not actually a specific person, it's like a type of person. It's like a character study without actually having a specific model that they're working from. So these two are actually portraits of young women. And we can actually see here, he's very much interested in textile, kind of material culture, like he's interested in the textiles and the trade routes this kind of reflects like the richness of Dutch trade, right? And the success, because this looks like velvet to me, but we see kind of this gold, really looks like a belt. Actually, it almost looks like it's not a knife though, can't be, she's a woman. But we have jewelry and we have this elaborate hat. But this kind of alludes to this overall sense of wealth that the Dutch Republic was experiencing, that was kind of coming into these elite classes and then trickling down into kind of everyone else. And this one is just a beautiful picture because you can see a sense of this. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know how to turn that off. You can see a sense of like how beautiful and transparent this veil is. All of this is kind of meant to bring to mind this sense of material culture, and Rembrandt is interested in these details. Now, these are examples of some what we think to be tronies. This one in particular, this man on the right, we know is a type of trony portrait. Now, people have tried to identify him. They're like, oh, it could be this sitter, it could be that sitter, but most historians seem to agree that this is more of a trony, that it's not really a portrait of anyone specific, but it's more of a character study that Rembrandt could kind of practice. And we've got that similar sense here, there's no real signifying factors, right? There's no accoutrements that we can kind of presume to be like, oh, it could have been this person, it could have been that person, but it looks like a trony of kind of a wealthy man, a wealthy individual, and it looks like a trony of a soldier, right? And so these were just character studies that Rembrandt was really kind of interested in. And he's got a very diverse approach, right? He's trying to depict this sense of reality in these characters that he's essentially kind of made up in his head. Now, this is, of course, a group portrait. And this was another type of portrait that Rembrandt was quite known for, because the standard group portrait was very kind of rigid and very flat, right? It was usually just like some floating heads and a little bit of like explanation on who the guild is or who they're representing, what group. And this is the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, I think is how you would pronounce his name. But these are obviously medical students studying under Dr. Tulp himself. And he's pointing to obviously a cadaver who has been kind of opened up by the hand, and you can see kind of the ligaments and everything. And although it seems a little bit grotesque to us, it was very much reflective of Dutch life and the interest that they had in science, because there were many different scientific discoveries happening during the 17th century. The microscope had been invented, the telescope had been invented. People were like finding new ways to view and experience life. And that's definitely part of this larger Dutch culture and Dutch interest in, not only anatomy and biology, but really science as a whole. And it was kind of like a forerunner to kind of the proper Enlightenment, right? So this definitely reflects that. And you can definitely tell that this is something an artist hand, what they can create is something that would have been kind of a play on this painting, that they're opening up this guy's arms, extending to his hand. And it's kind of meant to comment on the overall creativity and attention to detail that a good artist can have. So it's kind of like Rembrandt's also like patting his back, right? Now, the Night Watch is, of course, one of the most popular scenes that Rembrandt has ever created. People love this scene. They still go crazy for it over in the Netherlands. And it would be easy to find any sort of information you want on this painting. It's been written about so much. But what we're interested in is now it's even got a different sense from this group portrait, even Dr. Tulpa. Although this has like a sense of action, it still kind of has this character of like, yeah, this is definitely a group portrait. This is a group portrait, but it does not seem that way. It seems more of like, I guess, a genre scene. But it is a group portrait because, I mean, look at all of these faces. These people paid to have their face pretty much painted into this group portrait of this particular, they were not warriors they were pretty much soldiers, but they weren't like actual military men. They were kind of called upon if the city was ever like in trouble. So I guess you could say they were military. They were different though. They were kind of a different branch, but they were kind of meant to be like the elders, the protectors of the city. But you can definitely see that there is attention to each individual face, but it's a very unique take on what group portraiture really was. And Rembrandt was known for that he kind of came in and like gave a refresh to all of this, older Netherlandish Renaissance style. And what's the most interesting is that this young girl is back here and she's carrying a chicken. And it just seems like a random intro, but Rembrandt was like, you know what, I'm feeling it today. I'm going to include this young girl carrying a chicken. And I've always thought that detail was just funny. I don't actually know like this. I'm sure there's some sort of symbolic aspect of it that I should know, but I don't know because I've always just thought it was funny. But there is of great attention to detail. I mean, obviously you can look at the costuming here. He's still interested in textiles. He's still interested in garb in general, of how to dress his subjects. But what's even cool, and I'm not sure I can zoom in very much. Oh, here we go. What's even cool is that this gun, it's as if this guy, let's see where it's as if this gun has been shot off accidentally and there's still smoke rising. So this is not the feather, right? This is smoke, and here are the feathers from this guy's hat. And so it's very much like a chaotic scene, but Rembrandt is very much paying attention to the details, which is, just, you could probably just stare at this work all day and not see everything there is to see. Let me get my screen back up to how it's supposed to be. There we go. So, having technical difficulties. One moment. Let's escape here. There we go. Okay. So we also have very intimate scenes. So there were numerous different genres of portraits. There were self-portraits, portraits of individuals. There were marriage portraits. There were figures of portraits that were guised as mythological figures. It was kind of a free-for-all, take your pick. But this is a marriage portrait of a Jewish couple. That's very sweet. And this is actually on the right, this woman on the right is actually a depiction of Saskia, who was Rembrandt's wife. And by all means, they had a very loving marriage. I didn't include it in this particular PowerPoint, but he has a beautiful sketch of her and an etching of her now that he made, I think, a few days after their wedding. And she's depicted as, of course, a Roman goddess right here. And I'm not sure which goddess she's actually depicted as, but, very much a romantic, mythological scene. So he was a bit of a romantic. And this kind of introduces us to his more religious works. Now, Rembrandt had a soft spot for Old Testament figures in particular, and we'll kind of get into that in just a second, but this is actually St. Matthew, and we can see the text, we can see his chapter in the Bible that he's writing right here, and the angel. This is very much a motif that we've seen in Italian art before. I think, yeah, from Caravaggio, kind of where the angel appears up high and then Matthew's, scared to death. And this is kind of Rembrandt's take on that. Like I said, he really loved history paintings, and so this was kind of his bread and butter, and he had a soft spot for particularly Old Testament figures. And this is a depiction of Bathsheba, and these two both kind of show this inner working, this inner essence of portraiture that Rembrandt was working on. And so that inner essence he transferred into religious figures as well. So we can definitely see how contemplative Matthew is right here, but we can actually see how contemplative Bathsheba is too. And funny enough, she holds a letter, and that makes us kind of contemplate the overall scene, right? Like, is she sad? Did she just learn of her husband's death? That you remember in the Bible story of David and Bathsheba's husband, whose name is escaping me, that David sent him to the front lines in order to be killed because Bathsheba ended up becoming pregnant. So it's kind of, is this a letter from someone random informing her of her husband's death? Is this a letter from David? Is he summoning her? It's meant to engage the viewer in our own sense of contemplation that reflects what Bathsheba is experiencing. And this trope of an unreadable letter is found in Dutch art in many sort of different genres, particularly in genre scenes themselves, usually depictions of women looking out windows and there's letters, and it's always presumed to be from a lover though. And so Rembrandt has kind of taken that trope and made us question it, right? So it's like, well, is it from her lover David? Is it about her husband? It kind of introduces us and puts us in the middle of this story. But this kind of this overall little bit, you see sadness, I think, definitely a somber mood, and it really, her face tends to take away from her very nude body, right? And this is how Rembrandt kind of depicted his nudes. It wasn't really so much about commenting on the ideal body like it kind of was in Italian art, but it was kind of this northern mesh of everything. Like, the body is beautiful, but the mind is at work here. And so it was kind of a different take on how to represent a nude, particularly in the northern tradition. Now, this is a biblical scene of Samson and Delilah, and the traditional motif of Samson and Delilah tend to take a more sensual role. It's usually the moment where Delilah and Samson are in bed. She's decided to cut his hair, or has just cut his hair, and he's now lost his powers. So there's always that element of the sensual, right? Or even the sexual, and depicting that relationship, because usually the couple is in bed or she's just got up, whatever. It's usually kind of like an interior scene. Well, here we're in more of a kind of an open cave-like structure. You can see like a wooden floor right here. So it's kind of like enter into this like an unknown interior. And here we have Delilah with the already cut hair, and she's already summoned the soldiers, and the soldiers are here. And here we actually have a man plunging a knife in Samson's eye, which is, a very violent take on a scene, right? It's a very unique take. It's a little bit of a grotesque take too, but Rembrandt has decided to depict this moment in particular, probably due to its heightened emotion, probably due to like its experimentation. This was the moment in the story that people did not depict in art, and Rembrandt was interested in that. And it was a way that he could kind of display different expressions on figures. We have Delilah, who almost seems a little bit smug, but now she's also seems maybe a little bit terrified too, to see the suffering of Samson. We have kind of the uncertainty here on this soldier. We have anger on these two and excitement on this guy. And of course we have pain in Samson. And all of these are very different expressive modes that, Rembrandt gives us a glimpse into, but that's something that he's very much interested in. And this is also Rembrandt's take of Susanna and the Elders. Now, we looked at kind of the very beautiful depiction Rubens had of Susanna and the Elders. You know, she's very voluptuous and very luscious, and she's very sensual. Her skin looks it's almost like tangible, right? It just makes you want to reach out and touch it. And that was the whole scene. It was very sensual. And here you get a sense of, you get an kind of this expectation of sensuality or even sexuality. You know, this is very much a depiction of a nearly nude body. She's very modest though. And it's really more of a disturbing scene, right? Like, you know, it's almost like Rubens and his beautiful depiction of Susanna almost distracted you from the mere kind of like the more disturbing aspects of it, that these two grown men were fixing to attack this woman, right? But Rubens has kind of situated within this really, honestly, gorgeous landscape. It almost looks like one of his print studies. And it's got, you know, foliage and flora all centered around it. But he's focusing on particularly Susanna's expression, and even on maybe the uncertainty and the unrestrained lust of these two men as well, that they almost can't help themselves, right? Because Susanna is so beautiful, so tempting. And we even have a beautiful depiction of her clothes that she's kind of laid aside here, you know, these sumptuous fabrics that he's interested in. So it's just it's a very different take, and it's very dark. And Rembrandt's work is quite dark. But this is the examples like where history scenes were kind of his bread and butter. We can obviously see that he has an affinity for them and even the small details. And that leads us into some of his prints. So I just wanted to include a couple of his more religious prints as well. We've kind of looked at his landscape, or just one of them. This is the 100 Guilders print is what it's titled. That's not the actual name Rembrandt gave it, but it's what historians gave it. And here we have just a ton of people that just give us like, you know, 30 different character studies, more than 30 maybe. And we have, this is a moment in Christ's ministry where he is preaching to the people, and we have kind of different scenes kind of meshed together from the Old Testament. We kind of have, there's that scene where the lame man who can't walk is like dropped in by his friends, right? So we presume that these are his friends right here. And this is the man that can't walk. There's a blind man in here somewhere. But the point really is that it invites you to study it. And remember that in these prints, Rembrandt is experimenting. So he's definitely experimenting with light and shadow. He's experimenting on where to situate figures, what would make a good composition. And he's experimenting whether these things would be worth painting and putting on the open market, and how good they were doing. And so if this did relatively well, he would keep printing it and keep selling them that way. And then he would actually make a painting that would cost more. So it was kind of a way for him to test out his own theories in his work and test out the market itself. And this is also a picture of Christ on the cross. And he is notorious. I probably should have shown different views of this for you, but he is notorious for reworking his etchings, right? So he would etch into a copper plate, of course, and after he would print on that, he was notorious for going and reworking the composition, and that's how he would experiment. And then he would do multiple prints in order to rework. We actually have evidence of him taking an older artist's etching onto a copper plate and even reworking that artist's work, because he's experimenting, right? He's wanting to know what works for him and what works for the art market. And he's an artist himself. And so he's interested in these things and how he can kind of make his own brand and make his own name. And that was part of the reason he was so interested in depicting himself in self-portraits as well. He was making a name for himself on the market, right? Because it's very much different. He's no longer trying to get commissions from wealthy patrons, although I'm sure he is in a very real sense, but a more consistent form of income is to make smaller works and sell them more often. And so that was his kind of whole thought process behind prints. I mean, much more, but just for this lecture. And we will end with some of his more mythological scenes as well. I think this is the rape of Europa. And of course, rape back then would just mean kidnapping, although it does have a sexual element to it. It's not what we would classify it today. So it was kind of more of the abduction or the kidnapping of Europa. And that just means like the founding, Europa was a figure in the founder of Europe. And we see her actually kind of leaving and crossing over to the sea, where she presumably is going to found Europe as we know it. And we actually get kind of a sense of a city kind of almost in ruin. It seems a little bit, decaying a little bit in the background. So Rembrandt was obviously, he knew his antiquity, right? Like he knew his classical studies, he knew his stories, right? But he was so different from Rubens in the sense of that he was much more interested in kind of this Dutch depiction of life. He was much more interested in what was happening in his own world versus kind of looking to the ancients for inspiration. So although we do have mythological scenes from him, they have a very unique Dutch character. They're not getting inspiration from the Italians or from earlier Greek and Roman sources. This does not look like a classical scene. I mean, this garb that they're in may be it may be ornate, it may be very luscious in a sense, but this does not scream like, oh yes, these are antiquity models, or these are classical female figures. I mean, they almost look like wealthy Dutch ladies. And it looks like it's situated in almost a Dutch countryside. And so he's really interested, like I said, he's very much reflective of this new cultural identity that the Dutch people were carving out for themselves in this newfound republic. And of course we'll end for one of the biggies, right? So Rembrandt is not ignorant. What I'm trying to say is Rembrandt is not ignorant to all of art history that has come before him. He's not ignorant to what people are looking for and what they are wanting. And he's not ignorant in his education. He's actually very much known for looking at very diverse sources for his work in his collection. Because he filed bankruptcy, what happened is that they go and have an inventory of all of his works. And what we found is that Rembrandt really spent his money on collecting as many items as he could from all over. This tells us that he was getting source materials from wherever, and it was coming from these newly established trade routes, right? So when they did an inventory, he actually had Mughal miniatures is what we call them, but they're Mughal paintings. So they're paintings from the Mughal Empire situated in India. So that they were it was a Muslim empire, but in India, and had a succession line of 7 or 8 emperors, I think. But these miniature paintings were coming from a very Persian tradition, a very Timurid tradition. And it was very much kind of what we would classify as kind of like Eastern tradition, Eastern art, Asian art. But he was looking at these things, and he was using it for his own work and his own interest in source material. And we find records upon records of that in Rembrandt's collection. And this idea of collecting itself was very popular in the Dutch Republic, right? So this is kind of where we get the beginning of collection rooms, or I think they might be called Kunstkamers or something like that. I just probably butchered that word. But what they are is rooms dedicated. It could be a collection of art. It could be a collection of scientific objects. It could be a collection of just various interests of whoever was there. But this idea of collecting came from the really overall success and the wealth generated from these newly founded trade routes and this newly founded republic as a whole. And so people just went crazy for it. And that's why Dutch art has been kind of a unique thing, a unique area to approach, because in this kind of Baroque period, they really turned from this more Italianate or classical history and really looked towards themselves as their source of this new history, of this new identity. And Rembrandt was very much a part of that.